Welcome back to the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. This is a second recording, I believe, or third recording for 2026. And, a lot has happened in just the first half of January. So I'm glad that I'm able to catch up with you, Dr. Warwick Powell. Again, Dr. Warwick Powell, a returning guest from Australia, expert on international relations, particularly on China. So now we're at a critical juncture again in the Sino-American relationship. It looks like Trump is going all out. He really knows what's good for television, right? So he's going after Venezuela, going after Greenland, and also Iran. And he all prefaced all three as this is how he is going to clip China's wings, so to speak, right? Because the justification for going to Venezuela is we're going to deny China and Russia foothold in Latin America. And the justification for Greenland, again, is to keep check on Chinese and Russian influence expanding in the Arctic as a result of the Arctic route opening up as a part of the climate change. And Iran, there's a protest in Iran, and Trump, is encouraging the protesters, but at the same time he's also threatening 25% tariff on any country doing importing oil to Iran. But this is not really any country, because China imports about 90% of Iranian oil exports. So this is really aimed at China. Where should we begin, Dr. Warwick, Dr. Powell?
Well, as you say, Carl, good to see you. Happy New Year. It's been a roller coaster ride already, hasn't it? And we are only 2 weeks into 2026. But of course, these events don't take place in isolation, do they? And what we've seen happen in Venezuela, what we're seeing unfolding in Iran, and of course, what we're seeing getting prepared in Greenland are part and parcel of, I think, a very consistent framework that Donald Trump has brought to America's approach to international affairs and the affairs of its region, and that is to pursue global primacy whilst adjusting to some new realities. The national security strategy that was announced late last year spoke a lot about the need for America to recalibrate how it approached the global environment. It had obviously changed, but it didn't abandon primacy at all. What it, of course, articulated was a revised approach to how it would do that. And part of that approach is to assert itself in the Western Hemisphere. The fact that the United States has been asserting itself and meddling in the politics of countries in Latin America now for the best part of almost 100 years, in a sense, makes this particular episode all the more predictable. And unfortunately for the countries in the region, they've rarely had a chance to get themselves stabilized and get themselves onto an economic development trajectory that doesn't at least involve some sense of vulnerability to American political and economic interference. So we're seeing a bit of that. As far as China's concerned, look, I think in a funny kind of way, China clearly lives inside the head of everyone inside the Beltway for free, right? The obsessions about China as being the threat to America really, I think, leads to not only irrational assessments and decision making, but also cultivates this incredibly caricatured view of the world, right? Now, in the Biden days, the caricatures was, the good guys and the bad guys, the autocrats versus the Democrats. In the Trump caricature world, there's a lot less of that, but there's still nonetheless a lot of cartoonish conceptions of China and other parts of the world. And if you take this question of oil, about 4% of China's oil comes from Venezuela. It's hardly going to make that big a difference. Venezuelan oil output is about 1% of global oil output. Right? Yes, there's proven reserves, there's a lot of them. So the cartoon character is it has the largest proven reserves in the world. But the reality, as ExxonMobil's executive pointed out, is a lot more complicated than that. Right? Just because there's a lot of something under the ground doesn't mean that somehow it's easy to get, easy to transform, and easy to make use of. And I think the reality is that America has talked itself into this oil business in Venezuela based on some historical exposure, but also really based on a cartoon character of what Venezuela really means in terms of the global oil game. So look, it's been a crazy start. The the kidnapping of a leader of another country is not something you see every day, and the fact that the Americans went in opens a lot of questions, of course, not only about American attitudes towards international law, but about what the dynamics are on the ground. And there's lots of theories, and we might touch on some of those later, or we might not. Let's see how we go. But look, that's at least the Venezuela stuff, as I see it.
Right. But what do you say to people who are saying, oh well, if China and Russia do nothing, as U.S. going after friendly countries, how is that gonna put a check on United States? Especially as other countries will be looking at this and possibly reevaluate their relationship vis-a-vis China, Russia, and United States.
Yeah, look, there's a few bits to unpack there. Look, there's an odd sense, particularly across a diverse cross section of the body politic globally, that has this sense that China and Russia should always be doing something, that they always need to react to every incident, every event, that there's some tactical requirement for some kind of an explicit responsive action, right? And yet, I don't think that either of those two countries or the leaders in those two countries view the world through those kind of lenses. Their engagement in the world and the design and prosecution of their strategic approach to national development and how they contribute more broadly to a global environment that suits their objectives, which is stability and economic development, ultimately leads them to take a much longer historical view about what's going on. So we tend not to get knee-jerk reactions anyway. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think people need to be realistic as well. I mean, there's only one country in the world that's always been in a position, certainly for the best part of the last 40 to 50 years, to intervene militarily, willy-nilly anywhere in the world, and that's the United States of America. No other country actually has set itself up to be able to do that. And there's actually a good reason for that. One, China, for example, has focused the development of its defensive capabilities around the idea that it needs to be strong in its own environment to defend itself. And it's done that in the context of a 75-year encirclement enabled and anchored by the might of the American military and navy, with forces and missiles operating out of Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, right? So China's approach has been about ensuring that it's not vulnerable to attack. It hasn't been about being a global policeman. It hasn't been set up to go and intervene wherever America decides to do something. Similarly, I think the USSR and Russia subsequently isn't set up to do that either. Okay, so I don't think it's even realistic for people to think like that. There's no strategic objective from China or Russia's point of view in that regard, and they're not set up to do it. So there are strategic and material realities that literally means that China and Russia aren't going to somehow suddenly leap into any and every theatre just because the Americans are. But I think that there's a third thing, which is also quite interesting and worth bearing in mind, and that is that, and I speak mainly, I guess, from the point of view of how those in China would be thinking, I think, strategically about the evolution of the global landscape, and that is that there are forces at work that no single country can actually bend. And these forces are incredibly powerful. They're the forces related to the shifting patterns of commerce, the ongoing developments of technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And those dynamics, and I might add in that, you know, the slow de-dollarization, right, of the world, where the US dollar is no longer the obvious global reserve, and the emergence of currency multipolarity. All of these things are happening, and they will continue to unfold regardless of these sorts of individual events, right? And so there's nothing, in a sense, that can stop it. So trying to intervene and commit resources, and in some ways expend real resources, as well as, you know, potentially put lives at risk, and also jeopardize, I think, a kind of soft power as well, and I'll touch on that in a moment, by intervening, ultimately it won't bear fruit, because it's not going to fundamentally change the forces and the trajectory of global, you know, economic and social development. In terms of this soft power question, I think, you know, people often talk about the United States having incredible soft power, right? But many surveys increasingly point to the fact that China is actually received far better in many parts of the world, and especially in the global south than the United States is. And for China to be able to achieve that outcome, despite the fact that arguably its communications and propaganda capabilities are well short of Hollywood, and all the training and capability that brings to the table, suggests that, in fact, a consistent focus on non-interference, economic development, non-judgmental collaboration, investment, trade, and those sorts of things ultimately bears fruit. So whilst countries may be nervous about the fact that the United States clearly has a president who is willing to capriciously intervene militarily in places, and they will consequently seek to keep their heads down and out of harm's way in the short term, their long run move is actually to hedge against American militarism, not to cave into it. And that means consolidating and strengthening their economic relationships, in particular with China. And the last thing I'll say on this point is, and this is the economic issue, we saw this during the course of 2025 with the trade wars as they were unfolding post 2nd of April. And what we saw was actually the demonstration of Chinese material capability. Sure, China doesn't have a military that can go around the world and match the Americans toe to toe wherever the Americans want to go, especially in the Caribbean, which is within a stone's throw of the United States, right? China isn't able to do that. But what it is able to do is deliver economic capacity for countries, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's access to markets, whether it's access to new technologies. And it's those things that will ultimately stand not only China in good stead, but ultimately contribute to the ongoing structural transformations of the world in the direction of a more multipolar and a fairer global system. What we're seeing from the US is a reaction to that. The United States is clearly experiencing a chronic case of displacement anxiety, right? And those in Washington who've lived a life of entitlement, global political entitlement, are clearly feeling very displaced. And, you know, displaced people with a sense of entitlement, backed by a truckload of hubris, together with access to a $1 trillion per annum defense system, you know, highly incentivized to lash out.
What do you say about to the people who say, oh, there's using what I call a reverse domino theory. Okay, so now United States going after Venezuela, Iran, maybe Greenland, but this eventually they will, if China and Russia wait on their hands, they will be next target after Venezuela and Iran has fallen. What do you say to that?
Yeah, they're nuclear powers. There's no need to have a further discussion. The United States might be heavily displaced and behaving like an extremely anxious major power, but the United States doesn't have a death wish either. And as much as you get a lot of bloviating on social media, with a bunch of people beating their chests, I don't think there is one person in Washington who thinks that pressing that red button is a good idea, and engaging in a direct military conflict with any of the other major nuclear powers is not a good idea, and I seriously doubt it's going to happen. Which, of course, doesn't mean we're not going to have incredibly tense situations and all sorts of proxy conflicts all over the world. I mean, one of the tactical moves, and perhaps even strategic moves, that the United States is making in this context is that it's going to stir up a lot of trouble everywhere, right? This is partly how a declining hegemon seeks to hold on to what it's got. As other countries find strength through collaboration, the best move for the hegemon is to seek to disrupt that. If anybody works through any game theoretic experiment, this is exactly what you'll get. In fact, on my Substack last year, sometime I worked through this a game scenario, and really did it for my own interest, but I published it anyway, which really looked at the dynamics between large groups of actors who are coordinating and collaborating, a single actor who doesn't want to, and what that single actor is likely to do. Well, that single actor is likely to try to divide and conquer. And that's what we're seeing from the United States. Look, the US isn't going to take on Russia or China, right? That's the reality of it. But it is going to seek to cause disruptions to parts of the world that will then have flow-on effects to China and Russia in terms of their economic development, their ability to influence outcomes. The United States is clearly concerned about not only this sort of generic sense of loss of influence, but with influence comes a fear that its material conditions will decline further, right? And so if you read, say, Bridge Colby's work, right, on who's architecting this shift to China, and an attempt to pull back from Europe, get the Europeans to take on more load. One of the key drivers of that is the claim that China is reaching a point where it can fulfill this regional hegemonic role. It's not in America's interest, because if China did that, it would deny America access to the fastest growing economic region of the world. Right? So America's concern is underpinned by concern that it's going to be cut out of the economic largesse of Asian growth. And many of these concerns, I think, are driven by very fundamental, not only strategic defensive interests, because frankly, what's going on in Greenland, Iran, and Venezuela are not what you'd traditionally call strategic defense interests, right? These aren't great power political requirements, because none of these places actually threaten the United States, right? These are resource driven. Right? The United States is concerned about losing access to resources, and funnily enough, this is exactly what drove American settler expansion over the last couple of hundred years as well. And so deep inside this DNA is this worry that it's going to run out of resources. And so it takes them over.
You mentioned that China offer a very attractive alternative to US-led unipolar world dominance, in that China is investing in infrastructure, is providing a alternative to the US hegemony. But what if you already mentioned U.S. is trying to play the spoiler role? It's trying to destabilize. The mean now is China builds and U.S. bombs. Well, what if U.S. decide dedicate itself to, okay, China, you're gonna build your Belt and Road project in these countries. Well, I'm gonna go into these countries. I'm gonna militarily intervene. I'm gonna do color revolution. I'm gonna do regime change, and wouldn't that be detrimental to the kind of the new new order that China is trying to build?
United States military planning always worked on the idea of being capable of fighting two full-on peer wars. It can't do that anymore. It can act as a spoiler, sure, but it won't have the resources to sustain any of this stuff. One of the things we've learned about the United States military system, its industrial systems and the logistics systems that backs it up, is that it was never designed for sustained warfare, and it certainly has never been designed for sustained successful occupation and nation building, right? So if you look at the last 20 odd years, the United States, of course, comes out of the gates really fast. It's got, the most advanced technologies. It can fly in, it can bomb the crap out of a place, and then it leaves again, right? Mission accomplished, no Americans hurt. Everyone is able to cheer about it. The flag goes up, and victory is declared. The question that Americans never seem to want to ask is, well, what next? Right? And it's the what next bit that creates the problems, right? Obviously, as a follow-on from bombing the crap out of a place, because you've now destroyed the economic foundations of a particular region. You've firstly, of course, given rise to massive human displacement, much of which will end up affecting America. So what happens in, for instance, Latin America is that every time the economy there, the economies there are adversely affected, you get a flood of people moving to North America, and yet North America, the United States of America in particular, is desperately keen to stop all of this from happening. But it's going to create a rod for its own back, right? So these wars, this spoiling activity, is resource intensive, and yes, it can sustain a lot of things I often say at a warfare without war kind of level, right? Which is disruptive. It creates risks. There'll be sabotage. There'll be information war campaigns and those sorts of things. But ultimately, sustaining this at global scale is actually very, very difficult. Now, let's not forget that countries are also not without their own capability of ultimately responding as well. So in the event that American resources become increasingly stretched, then the capability of these countries to respond and deal with these problems actually improves. The last thing to remember is that much of American defensive capability, and I say defensive really, I mean, how can you use the word defensive capability when they're being sent all over the world bombing other people? But anyway, American military capability is contingent upon its ability to source reliably a whole swathe of raw materials and intermediate inputs from, guess what, Chinese supply chains. Reports by consultants at the Pentagon, Gavini, for example, identify that an American warship is dependent upon supplies from about 10,000 Chinese firms. Right? The exposure to Chinese supply chains, not only in rare earths, but in all sorts of other things, to actually make the American military industrial complex functional is huge. Right? So, if the United States seriously wants to play this game, then it needs to do two things, really. Firstly, it needs to find alternatives to China as suppliers for all of this. Ergo, it's desperately trying to, create a rare earths industry out of the blue. And secondly, of course, it's got industrial system problems anyway. So not only do we have input supply chain problems, we've also got industrial system problems. The United States military industrial complex is not set up to ramp and scale in ways that would be meaningfully necessary in the event that it wanted to become the global spoiler, right? It simply doesn't have the capability to make enough stuff. So its spoiling efforts are going to be, I think, quite tactical, if you will. They will be annoying, but they aren't going to be of a scale in terms of breadth or in terms of duration that will ultimately enable it to prevail in this game. That being the case, what is it trying to do? Because I don't think anyone in the Pentagon, by the way, believes that America can sustain any of these long-term campaigns. Right? The sensible people in the military actually still learn some mathematics, though there are people who doubt the depth of the strategic maths that these folk learn, but nonetheless, I think they've got some basic understanding of materials and maths, and I think they know that this ambition is actually materially not viable. So they're going to have to do something else. So I think what's going on is that there's a little bit of a displacement reaction. There's an attempt to, I'll use it, I'm not sure whether it's an Australian phrase alone, but dogs tend to piss on their posts to mark territories, right? And I think that there's a bit of that going on as well. Right? So I think that the United States feeling a little bit vulnerable, sensing displacement as the unquestioned hegemon, is in a sense marking its territory, and it's doing that in really the only way that it now knows how to, and that is to go and bludgeon somebody, to drop some bombs on people, and then threaten them with some economic coercion.
That's fair. But why is Trump going after Greenland? I'm trying to wrap my head around that, because all the justification for U.S. taking Greenland is, supposedly because Greenland has occupied a very strategic location. It sits at the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and it's a hole in America's defense, and it to be plugged because pretty soon the Arctic ice cap will melt, and there will be a lot more Chinese shipping through the Arctic. That China and Russia will increase their activity in the Arctic, so we must counter that. But it doesn't really fly if you look deeper, because U.S. already have access to Greenland as U.S. have military base in Greenland. U.S. have, because Greenland is part of Denmark, and being Denmark and United States both in NATO, U.S. have all the military access they want in Greenland, so they don't need to grab it as for giving the reason, if it's just geostrategic reasons. So that and in doing so, Trump is really antagonizing the Europeans, of course. I think the Europeans are not going to do much, because the European leaders are pretty spineless, but even so, it is poisoning the transatlantic alliance. And why is he doing that? Why is he at the risk of destabilizing NATO, destabilizing transatlantic alliance? Why is he making a grab for Greenland, you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, because as you say, the United States could achieve everything that it wants from a strategic point of view in relation to Greenland without doing anything other than exploiting its position within NATO, expanding its current military presence, and lo and behold, surprise, surprise, they could even invest in Greenland and conduct trade and economic development, right? And expand their presence through all of those pretty normal means. So why would they do, the grand takeover? Look, it's hard to understand, but perhaps there's some ways that we could at least gain an appreciation for why you'd go to these lengths. One, I think President Trump does see himself as a president of historic consequence, and a president of historic consequence needs to have trophies. Okay, so I think Greenland is an easy trophy. to be a president of historic consequence. The second reason, I think, is that there are some resources in Greenland that perhaps the risk assessors in the United States believe should not be left to indirect channels of control, that the United States would be better off having absolute control by controlling a territory. That may be a second reason. So it's a question of risk calculus. Can we afford to leave this as something that we indirectly control through NATO, but don't quite control? I think the third thing, though, is that it's quite clear that President Trump does not have a lot of time for the Europeans. And this is one way of really demonstrating to the Western Europeans who's boss. And I think in the process, ultimately, from the United States point of view, trying to, through this, lock in Western Europe as a subordinate to Washington's global power position. There are some risks in all of this, as you touch on. It spoils the relationship between the Western European populations more than necessarily the elites in Brussels and the United States. It could add fuel to the growing nationalistic political sentiments in Western Europe, where there are more people across more of the member states who are unhappy with the direction that Brussels is taking Europe. Brussels in both the EU sense and in the NATO sense, that there is a belief that the political elite running the military and the, let's call it the economic arm of the European apparatuses, have lost sight of their priorities. They're no longer focused on the improvement of European living conditions as much as they are obsessed by keeping the Americans locked into an unwinnable war against Russia. So I think that there's a fair bit of that sort of stuff going on, because without that sense of personal triumph and leaving a historical mark, and perhaps that risk calculus question, there really isn't a particularly huge need to expend what I think would be quite a lot of political capital to take Greenland. Now, of course, I don't think that there are any impediments. Not only will the Europeans not be able to do anything, I don't think it would actually take much. There are a handful of ports and airports in Greenland. There's not a lot of roads. There's 56,000 people. There's an American base. And I would have thought that the United States could, in effect, take charge of all of those critical pieces of infrastructure, which is the connection that makes it possible for people to come and go from Greenland within 2 days, 3 days. It wouldn't take much at all. And so the real question is, in my mind, is this just more bluff and blunder, and we're going to see a great big Greenland taco, or is Trump actually going to make the move?
Yeah, we're all waiting to see how the fall of this going to be. Now, let's pivot to Iran, because this is a big thing. It looks like the previous 12 war against Iran was Israel was enabled by United States. That was not successful because Iran showed that you actually possess the firepower to fight back. Now, the whole encouragement of Iranian protest and Iranian civil strife, this seems to be coordinated. I mean, I see this on social media. All the usual suspects are now jumping out. All the ones who cheer for Venezuelan intervention are now, suddenly they're all Democrats for Iran. They're all like for Iran embracing democracy and freedom and all that. Is this United States trying to do regime change on the cheap? I mean, because they are currently had their hands tied in the Caribbean, so they're trying to try a different approach to soften their perceived adversary in Tehran?
Look, I think, well, there's a few things to piece together, right? So the 12-day war came to an end with a ceasefire that was actually requested by the United States. And that clearly demonstrated that the United States and Israel lacked the capacity to ultimately land the knockout blow. The government in Tehran survived and has, of course, since then sought to consolidate its position domestically. I think also Tehran has begun to reach out a little bit more, or has become a little bit more open to greater dependence on China and Russia, particularly in areas such as military or defense-related technologies and assistance, which Iran had for a long time been very reluctant to take on board those offers of assistance. So there's been some change. Now, the United States clearly was never going to let sleeping dogs lie. We know now that very recently Netanyahu visited Trump and the discussion was about Iran. But we also know now, and I've seen this in various reports, including a story in Forbes, that talks specifically about the number of Starlink terminals that had been smuggled into Iran and which had been operational in Iran as part of the coordination mechanisms for the recent round of public demonstrations. Now, some 40,000 terminals have been smuggled into Iran. And the reason they've been smuggled is because they were illegal. Okay, now, smuggling 40,000 terminals in and then getting them into the hands of, the people that you're working with to coordinate these things is not a fly-by-night activity. They're not dropped from the sky. It's not like you fly a drone over and just drop a bunch of Starlink terminals and bada bing, bada boom, it's all up and running. The deployment of the Starlink infrastructure, I would suggest, began, if not before the 12-day war, not long thereafter. And the aim was to enable the mobilization of forces inside Iran in an effort to destabilize the government. We know that there was external interference, not only because of Starlink, but because there have been quite a number of published stories now in which the role of Mossad has been explicitly acknowledged. The agents involved in the protests and behind the scenes in fomenting the local anger. Now, local anger, of course, does exist to varying degrees. It's actually hard to generate opposition against the government if there aren't certain things that give people a reason to be angry about, or give people things to feel that they have nothing left to lose, right? And of course, the economic circumstances is the most obvious one. All those other things you've mentioned, the democracy and the human rights and, whatever the latest political fancies are that liberals in particular in the West latch onto, they're a bit by the by, right? But, that helps broaden the sort of Western support base. But basically, the agitation revolved around inflation. And much of that, I think, was occasioned by a dramatic devaluation of the rial, the Iranian currency. I suspect that since the 12th of, or the 12-day war, there has been a progressive accumulation of rial by entities hostile to Iran, and that the accumulated rial was subsequently dumped, causing a collapse in the value. So the value of the rial dropped, I think, something like 40% from memory, very, very quickly in the last month. which of course leads to a rapid escalation in prices as import prices rise. So the orchestrated campaign went something along the lines of secure a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, roll out a communications infrastructure so that you can coordinate and mobilize people, buy up the real so that you can manipulate the currency, short the currency when the time came, short the currency, cause inflation, mobilize people, get people out on the streets, then mobilize social media and hope that that is enough to destabilize the government. The government has so far, by the looks of it, successfully quelled and responded to the demonstrations. And interestingly, and this goes back to that issue of collaboration with Russia, I think, they managed to do that because they were able to intercept and ultimately stop the Starlink capabilities. Now, that in and of itself is significant because that really does raise the issue more broadly around how other countries will learn the lesson about how to control their information space. Because clearly the information space and the infrastructure that impacts that space is central to regime change operations. The second thing that the government clearly did was it blocked the internet, and that not only, well, that contributed obviously to the Starlink question, but it also meant that it limited the ability for external forces to intervene with additional information campaigns. The third thing, and this is where I think it really, where the policing response becomes very, very interesting, is that the Starlink requires a spatial signal. So those who had the Starlink terminals could be located, and they have been. Many have been, and there have been many arrests, and many demonstration organisers have been, quote, rounded up and arrested, unquote. Okay. We know that there's been a lack of success insofar as regime change is concerned because, one, the government's still there, and two, President Trump has just earlier tweeted, a message to protesters that, help is coming, keep protesting. And that, of course, means that there has not been success. The last thing which tells us there hasn't been success, and this is probably the more worrying thing, is that President Trump, the American embassy or the virtual embassy in Tehran has also issued on its webpage a message to Americans to get themselves out of Iran. And that would certainly be something that any embassy would do if they knew or expected with reasonable confidence that their government was planning an aerial campaign to bomb the country. And so I think that we are clearly heading in that direction. The one last thing I'll mention here is that whilst we've seen a lot of naval buildup in and around Venezuela, there has actually been some military buildup in and around the Middle East by the Americans, but they have not yet sent in a significant naval presence. But nonetheless, I think it is quite clear that the United States executed a plan that sought to, if not successfully overturn the government, create the reason for this second round of military intervention. And that reason is we have to enter the fray because those awful Iranians are killing and injuring protesters. And it's incumbent upon us now to, to go and do something about it. So Iran is on tenterhooks, of course, as a result. But the campaign to destabilize, well, let's see how much instability there is. But certainly, insofar as there being a regime change is concerned, I think that has so far failed.
Yeah, this is to crank up the economic pressure on Iran, the same way they have done in Venezuela, trying to strangulate the economy. The U.S. Navy pretty much put on a economic blockade on Venezuela by stopping tankers coming in to pick up Venezuelan oil. Now Trump is threatening to to place 25% tariff on any country doing oil business with Iran. Now, the thing is, it's not any country that's importing Iranian oil. It's 90% of Iranian oil exports go to one country, and that's China. Now, this is a little bit baffling because China and US just had a trade war, and it just briefly declared a truce in South Korea when Trump met with President Xi. Why are we going back to the old days? Are we going back to the first half of 2025 now with tariff being raised on China again? Oh, what's your take on that?
Well, I think that we run the risk. Well, from Trump's point of view, I guess that is what the effect is. I'm not sure that was actually the intended objective. One of the things about the Trump administration is that it tends to have a very limited array of responses to circumstances, and tariffs is, one of the top draw responses that the president seems to draw on whenever he, is displeased or disappointed about something. So, of course, out comes the tariffs again. But it's not just China that does business with Iran, right? There's actually a whole list of countries. I'll read them, right? China, of course, the UAE, Turkey, Iraq, India, Pakistan, Russia, Afghanistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Syria, Oman, Qatar, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Germany, Italy, and France. They all have some trade relationships with Iran. So is this 25% tariff going to be imposed on products from all of those countries or not? The tweet was effective immediately. Well, it's been 24 hours or so since that tweet. Is American customs applying a special 25% tariff onto all goods coming through customs as of now? I suspect not, right? So again, there's a difference between, or a gap between, the tweet and the action. But I think the response was not necessarily well thought through because there are many unintended consequences. I think it was an expression of frustration that the regime change operation did not actually achieve its objectives. I think that there's another frustration in all of that too. I mean, look, President Trump clearly has a bee in his bonnet about Iran. He's not unlike many Americans of his generation, right? Got a real set against Iran. But I think one of the real frustrations is actually the fact that Russian technologies were successfully deployed to undermine the principal coordinating technology that had been smuggled into Iran to facilitate this regime change operation. And of course, that technology comes from on again, off again bestie Elon Musk. So there's a lot of frustration in Washington, and why 25%? Why not 35? Why not 50? Why not 100? I mean, it's just it seems to be very symptomatic that whenever something happens that President Trump is unhappy about and it involves some third country, the response is basically the threat of some sanction on somebody or the threat of some tariffs on somebody else.
In fact, President Trump just said that any anti-tariff position is basically a pro-Chinese position, which is a crazy thing to say. But I think he also implicitly, it's United States kind of implicitly admitting it has lost in a open market, free market competition with China. That's why it needs tariffs. Like this is a reversal from like 19th century or early 20th century, with United States going around demanding open door policy to China, for example, demanding China open its doors to all the foreign goods, and capital flows, etc. And now it's United States that's putting up barriers everywhere.
Look, it seems
Go
to keep coming around, doesn't it? Right? Because Liberation Day, it was all about rejuvenating American manufacturing, bringing the jobs home, reshoring companies, reindustrializing America in the heartland. Well, none of it's happened. In fact, manufacturing employment continues to fall, right? But there's another question too, and that is the administration's serious economic vision one in which American workers are making T-shirts and jocks and socks? Is that actually the serious vision? Is the vision that American workers will somehow be mass manufacturing furniture by hand? Is that the vision? Because if that's the vision, then America will never be globally competitive. Now, of course, you can put tariffs right up and ensure that imported alternatives are so expensive that no one can afford to buy them, and so they're forced to buy locally. But it will be a higher cost, lower standard of living society, right? So is this the economic vision? If the economic vision is to modernize industry, then it's actually going to need to import a lot of things. It's going to have to import everything it needs to upgrade the electricity network, right? From copper for the wires through to transformers. It can't do that without importing capital equipment from China. Does it want to have automated factories that are high precision, high efficient, low energy, right? Well, if it wants to do that, it's either going to have to get the equipment from expensive suppliers, some of which are in America, but others will be in Japan and Germany and other parts of Europe, or it's going to have to find lower cost options from, let me think, China. Is that what it wants to do, right? So I don't think that there's any real clarity. There's actually a culturally driven and an emotionally driven economic strategy, if you can call it that, which is really a politics of nostalgia. We're going to make America great again, right? And the idea of great is actually this cartoon image of what America was like in 1950. But this is 2025, and I don't think there actually is a clear sense of what America 2025 needs to look like, or what, more to the point, America 2035, 2045 needs to look like. Everything at the moment is defined about what America must do to stop China, right? And that doesn't advance America. In fact, putting all of your efforts into trying to stop someone else actually takes a lot of effort away from the things you could do to make the quality of life of your own citizens a lot better. But this is where America's at. America's at a point, Carl, where its domestic tensions and problems are spilling over globally. And the reason they spill over globally is because the political elite want to distract people from the domestic causes of the problems, and they want to project the causes onto others in the world, and at the same time generate a sense of cultural nationalism that galvanizes a population against someone else. Don't look to Washington for your problems, let alone your solutions. Blame it on someone else. And that's why, until America can actually find a way to come to peace with itself, to fix its economic structures so that it's a fairer place, a more productive place, and a place where people actually have social mobility, well, America will always be not at peace with the rest of the world.
Well, Warwick, it's so much easier just to blame China and immigrants. That's the try and true method for any U.S. politician, especially in hard economic times. Just blame China and immigrants, and that's exactly what they're doing right now. And I don't know whether it's working out for them, but they did get Trump elected. And then he has another 3 years to go, unfortunately. Yeah. So what is your crystal ball for the rest of 2026? How do you think all these effort of Trump lashing out uh, to preserve the U.S. hegemony will play out, both
Well,
domestically and abroad?
well, it'll be messy, right? So, I asked the question before, what then question, right? So you can, declare mission accomplished, but it's actually the what then issues that create the real long lasting problems. And the United States actually doesn't have any coherent answer to the what then for all of its interventions, which leads you to think that, in fact, these interventions are not of any serious, substantial, strategic nature at all, but are in effect expressions of the sort of deep anxieties that the United States elite is feeling at the moment. Let's not forget that this year, 2026, is a midterm election year. President Trump has said on a number of occasions that it is imperative that the Republicans hold on to the House and the Senate, because if not, he will be impeached. He is deeply driven by personal requirements to survive this electoral cycle. And that will lead to, I think, increased rattiness in responses, lots of populism. So the promises to, bring down credit card fees, for example, is one. That there was that other stuff about, extending mortgages to make houses more affordable. All these sorts of things will be rolled out to try to hold the base together, that something's being done. And if the Democrats oppose these things, all the better, because he's just got to say, I tried and I need more votes to push it through. So domestic considerations will, as usual, be overwhelmingly critical. The international stuff is really a function of all of that, right? So a president who is experiencing economic problems at home will seek to muscle up militarily abroad, right? This is about building the stature of the United States, putting up the flag around which everybody can rally, and imploring people, in a sense, to vote for the president because the president is taking on the world. And so there will be, I think, more messiness because there's no coherence in any of this. More what I've just said, rattiness, which means, I think, basically a lot more mess that will have long-lasting implications. The mop-up will be difficult. And and then on top of that, you've got at the moment a mooted trip to Beijing in April. Right now, I think we've seen how China is dealing with all of this. It's incredibly calm and unflappable. It must be incredibly frustrating for a politician who clearly thrives on the cut and thrust of energy and things to to engage with a counterparty who is so unflappable. But China will, I think, respond in a very cold, calm manner. It's going to be very consistent in terms of what it's doing. It really does have a very long-term view, and it's not because there's some sort of cultural sense of, China thinks in millennia and all of that. It's because China actually has developed, I think, a sense that history has powerful forces that individuals and even countries can't actually change the course of. But what you've got to do is figure out how you go with the flow and how you might adapt to the ebbs and the currents of history. But you can't just willy-nilly go and enforce yourself on others. And so China, I think, has reached a conclusion that its position is strong. It has solid support from around the world because it is the stable institution, if you will, now around which global economic development can take place, and it will hold its ground when it comes to the United States. As I said earlier, it's a nuclear power, and being a nuclear power with a strong economy means that you will hold yourself as a peer to the United States, and you will be treating the United States respectfully as a peer but you'll also expect the United States to treat you the same way. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that as well. But Donald Trump's going to have to sell all of this as big wins coming into November.
Well, we already have the Canadian Prime Minister who went to China with his explicit goal of reducing dependence on the trade relationship with the United States. I mean, I think it's
Look,
now.
There's two countries, Carl, that have deep relationships with the United States, actually, from a trade point of view. And, you know, Europe does as well, but far less than it used to have. And that's Canada and Mexico. The rest of the world has actually, over the last 25 years, progressively diversified away from the United States. The US provides about, from memory now, 12% of global import demand, right? Substantially less than what it did 50 years ago. And it's just not as important in relative terms anymore. That's all it is. The structure of the world economy has changed, and the United States' place within that has also changed. These are not forces that you can somehow turn around through sheer will, right? These are the consequences of long, slow transformations in structural competency within economic systems, with people with the right knowledges and skills. You know, we've talked about the fact that the United States now has literacy and numeracy standards which are going down, and they're actually not the standards that you need for a modern industrial economy, a digitalized industrial economy. Now, you don't fix that with a click of a finger. You're certainly not going to fix it with a few imported smarties from around the world, mainly because part of your own country doesn't want them, right? You're going to need to invest in a whole generation of human capacity development, a whole generation. This won't fix for 20 years. This is the hard yards that the United States actually needs to embark upon. The fact that it's going through this period of chronic displacement anxiety, I hope, is actually the moment in which it comes to terms with these realities. Not that it's an unimportant country, but that it is just one of the big countries that must begin to behave as a normal country.
I agree completely. But it will remain to be seen whether U.S. finally accept its place as just one of many poles in a multipolar world. And thank you again, Professor Powell, for making your time to speak to us. You know, I certainly have learned a lot every time speaking with you, and I look forward to talk to you in the future, because I'm sure there will be more things going on the rest of the year. For people who want to follow you on social media or elsewhere, where would they go?
Yeah, my Substack's probably the best place for sort of more serious stuff. warwickpowell.substack.com, and people can find me on X as well with the handle at Bao, BAOSHAOSHAN. That's my Chinese name, where I'm a little bit more irreverent, a little bit more flippant, but I think that probably suits that particular medium a bit more. So they're the two places, and of course I've got that little channel of mine, which is really my way of engaging with research colleagues, but people can find that, I'm sure, in the link below, because I can't even remember what it, TIO Talks. That's right, TIO Talks with Warwick Powell. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, and thanks everyone for listening in. Until next time.